Hey everyone! Tonight we dive headfirst into the stubborn riddles the Middle Ages left behind. Mysteries that refused to stay buried. Secrets that kept whispering until modern science finally decided to listen. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as drunken monk gossip, wild tavern rumors, or medieval clickbait. But under the cold, clinical lens of archaeology and chemistry, they're coming back to life, and they're far stranger than we ever imagined. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you love stepping into history's shadowy corners, and subscribe if you want more journeys like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always incredible to see this channel turn into a little global gathering. Alright, lights down. Maybe get a blanket or turn on a fan for that soft, conspiratorial hum. Tonight's first stop, Lincoln Cathedral. This soaring Gothic masterpiece wasn't just England showing off. It was England yelling at God, "Look what we can build!" Flying buttresses arch like the ribs of a giant stone beast. Stained glass pours color over the nave like divine confetti, and every corner screams drama. It's a church built to impress heaven or terrify sinners into repentance. But under this holy spectacle, in the 1960s, archaeologists found something peculiar: a lone skeleton. At first, everyone assumed it was a monk because honestly, who else would be under a cathedral? But this burial was wrong. No habit, no rosary, no carefully folded arms. Instead, the body was face down, thrown into the earth like someone was in a hurry. Science stepped in, isotope analysis, basically reading tea leaves in bones. The result? This man wasn't local. He was Scandinavian. His skeleton showed the wear of a long, punishing journey. Imagine him trudging mile after mile from Northern Europe, each step fueled by faith or desperation, until he finally reached Lincoln Cathedral, only to collapse. The clergy couldn't just leave him in the street, bad optics, so they gave him a grave, but not a fancy one. No holy ceremony, just a quiet hole and a shrug. For centuries, people assumed this poor soul was disgraced. Turns out he was just devout and very, very tired. Moral of the story? If you're planning to walk across Europe to find God, maybe carry a note that says, "Not a heretic, just committed." Now, fast forward to a king whose bones were missing for over 500 years. Richard III, Shakespeare's favorite villain, the man who supposedly cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," during battle. His death at Bosworth ended the Wars of the Roses, but his body vanished. Centuries later, his final resting place turned out to be, wait for it, under a parking lot in Leicester. Not a crypt, not a castle, just parking bay number 7 behind a city council building. Imagine the royal dignity. In 2012, archaeologists with ground-penetrating radar and nerves of steel dug under the tarmac and found a twisted spine, a battered skull, and battle wounds that matched Richard's last stand. DNA confirmed it using a Canadian descendant who probably never expected a cheek swab to connect him to a king buried under asphalt. Richard was reburied with honor, his reputation still debated, but at least he's no longer sharing eternity with gum wrappers and oil stains. And then there's the wildest book of the Middle Ages, the Voynich manuscript. Discovered in 1912 by a Polish book dealer, this 240-page fever dream is filled with unknown script, alien plants, naked women floating in green pools, and star charts that look like an astrologer's bad trip. For decades, scholars thought it was a hoax, but recently AI cracked parts of it. Not the whole thing, of course, but enough to reveal its language. A lost form of proto-romance, the kind of early Latin people spoke but never thought to write down. So instead of being a map to the Holy Grail or a medieval spellbook, the Voynich manuscript might just be a 15th century wellness guide. Herbal remedies, astrology tips, women's health notes, basically Gwyneth Paltrow, but on parchment. Finally, let's go to 12th century Suffolk, where the strangest mystery of all unfolded. 2 children appeared in the village of Woolpit, and they were green. Yes, actually green. They spoke no known language, wore strange clothes, and refused every food except raw beans. As they slowly adjusted to normal life and normal diets, their green hue faded. Modern historians think they were malnourished refugees, probably Flemish, lost and starving. But in medieval England, they became legends. The boy sadly didn't survive, but the girl lived, learned English, and said they came from a land of twilight, where the sun never shone. A poetic memory of a dark forest, perhaps, or something stranger. Skeletons beneath cathedrals, kings under parking lots, books that spoke a language no one knew, and children from nowhere. The Middle Ages are never short on surprises. The priest is in the middle of his sermon, probably delivering yet another dire warning about eternal damnation, or maybe railing against the perils of eating cheese on Fridays. The congregation sits in silence, half terrified, half asleep. Somewhere near the back pew, though one bored peasant teen is fighting off death by boredom the only way he knows how, scratching a crude little sword fight into the church wall. And so began one of the strangest historical puzzles in England. For centuries, the walls of medieval churches were found covered in odd little carvings. Circles, stars, strange geometric symbols. Enough to make early historians wonder if their parishioners were waging a secret war against demons in between prayers. The benches were already splintered enough to make anyone itchy. But the carvings? They really made scholars scratch their heads. Victorian researchers decided these had to be magical wards. Marks designed to trap witches, confuse demons, and keep evil spirits out. Interlocking circles, daisy wheels, runes, terrifying symbols if you've just had too much sacramental wine. They were convinced that medieval villagers lived in constant fear of Satan personally showing up during Mass to drag them away, which, let's be honest, might have been more thrilling than the sermon itself. But then came the Buzzkill Brigade, modern archaeologists. With laser scanners, databases, and 28,000 documented examples, they revealed that most of these markings were not mystical at all. Many were just names. Ships, cats, sword doodles. Messages like, "I was here, Gerald, 1378. Far from being desperate demon traps. Some were prayers, some were acts of devotion, and others were the medieval equivalent of carving your crush's initials into a school desk. Sure, a few circles might have been hex wards, but not every scratch was a desperate attempt to imprison the devil in limestone. Next time you're in an ancient English church and see one of those marks, relax. It's not a warning of demonic infestation. It's just Gerald. Bored, fidgety Gerald, trying to survive another 2-hour homily by vandalizing holy stone. Then there's Rungholt, whispered about like the soggy Atlantis of the North Sea. A rich, arrogant city said to have been swallowed in a single night by a storm so fierce they called it the Great Drowning of Men. The medieval version of clean your room, or the sea will eat your entire town. Legend had it that Rungholt was decadent, irreverent, and so rude they once refused shelter to a poor priest, which, in medieval morality tales, is the ultimate sin. God, apparently unimpressed, unleashed divine coastal renovation. A flood that erased the city completely. For centuries, skeptics said Rungholt was just a morality tale, a soggy fable to scare children. But modern archaeology finally found it. Using LiDAR scans and sonar mapping, researchers located harbor walls, drainage systems, and dikes buried under the Wadden Sea. The city was real, a thriving North Frisian port, full of trade and life, until climate change, rising storm surges, and neglected dikes turned it into fish habitat. In other words, the sea didn't destroy Rungholt because the people were wicked. It destroyed them because they built a rich city on a swamp with medieval water management. The Knights Templar, part warrior monks, part conspiracy theorist fever dream. Their name gets thrown into everything from secret treasures to holy grails to cryptic symbols. So when a mysterious cave was discovered in Shropshire, a sandstone labyrinth full of candle niches, strange carvings, and ominous atmosphere, the internet predictably shouted, "Templar confirmed," The Canton Caves look like a perfect Dan Brown set piece. Narrow tunnels, carved pillars, weird acoustics. It's basically a medieval escape room without the clues. For years, rumors swirled that outlawed Templars met here in secret to perform forbidden rites, whispering Latin prayers while trying not to smack their helmets on the low ceiling. But modern research ruined the fun again. The cave is probably 19th century, not 13th. Likely used by Victorian spiritualist clubs and later by pagan groups, Goths, and at least one very artsy wedding photographer. Yes, rituals did happen there, but more cloak and incense cosplay than sacred knightly oaths. And then there's the most famous cold case in England, the Princes in the Tower. Summer 1483, two royal brothers, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, ages 12 and 9, disappear inside the Tower of London. Not in the oops, we wandered off sense. More like political ambition just happened to us. The prime suspect? Their uncle, Richard III, who locked them up for their protection. Then, surprise, became king. But some argue Henry VII, who defeated Richard and married the prince's sister, had just as much motive to make sure no surviving York heirs were left to challenge him. In 1674, two small skeletons were found buried under a tower staircase. Charles II immediately decided they were the princes and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey. Case closed. Except, no one ever tested them. No carbon dating, no DNA, just good old-fashioned royal guesswork. Now, centuries later, historians are pressing to finally run DNA tests, possibly solving one of England's oldest mysteries for good. The science is ready, the descendants exist. Now we just wait for the Church of England to say yes. And finally, the strangest epidemic of the Renaissance. The dancing plague of 1518. Strasbourg. A woman named Frau Trophia walks into the street and starts dancing. Not joyfully, not for fun, but like her body won't stop. Within days, dozens joined her. Within weeks, hundreds were dancing, collapsing from exhaustion, even dying from strokes and heart failure. The authorities did the most medieval thing possible. They built a stage and hired musicians. Because clearly, if people are dying from dancing, what they really need is better music. For centuries, scholars have tried to explain it. Mass hysteria? Ergot poisoning from bad bread? Demon possession? Hot blood, according to medieval doctors who had all the medical rigor of horoscope writers. Whatever it was, it remains one of history's most haunting and bizarre mass events. A tragedy, a mystery, and yes, a little bit of nightmare fuel. Today, though, most modern historians lean toward two explanations that make far more sense than demonic disco. The first, mass psychogenic illness, what we'd now call mass hysteria, the kind that hits entire communities when stress levels are stretched tighter than a lute string. And make no mistake, Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker ready to blow. Famine stalked the streets, plague had ripped through, politics were a mess, and religion weighed heavy on everyone's mind. In short, these people didn't need a dance floor, they needed bread, therapy, and maybe a long nap. The second theory is far more psychedelic. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and, when consumed, can cause wild hallucinations eerily similar to what you'd get on LSD. It's the same culprit often linked to the Salem witch trials centuries later. So yes, it's entirely possible these poor souls were unintentionally tripping hard, seeing strange visions, and feeling an irresistible, full-body urge to groove rather than shriek about demons. Modern reevaluations suggest the truth might have been a messy cocktail of all the above. Trauma, hunger, feverish piety, and perhaps a little toxic bread to spice things up. The result? Something that looked less like divine punishment and more like a medieval rave spiraling way out of control. But let's leave the dance floor for now and talk about one of the most fascinating figures of the Crusader era. A teenage king with leprosy who managed to outlive nearly all of his enemies, govern a fragile kingdom with shocking skill, and die young enough to make every tragic rock band jealous. Welcome to the hauntingly inspiring story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. When young Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy as a child, everyone assumed he'd be gone before he ever mattered. His fate was supposed to be quiet, anonymous, a sad footnote in someone else's chronicle. But Baldwin refused to stay off stage. He took the crown at 13, personally led armies into battle, and outwitted Saladin, yes, the Saladin, for over a decade. This was the 12th century, an era when paper cuts could kill you and cheese could be a death sentence. And yet Baldwin survived long enough to become one of the most competent rulers of the Crusader states. Historians have always puzzled over one question. What exactly did Baldwin have? Was it truly the full-blown, disfiguring leprosy we associate with medieval imagery, or something milder, exaggerated by enemies for political theater? Recent scholarship points toward tuberculoid leprosy, a form of Hansen's disease that damages nerves and skin, but doesn't necessarily produce the dramatic melting face appearance seen in medieval art. The gradual muscle loss and paralysis could explain why Baldwin eventually needed help to hold a sword or mount a horse, yet kept his mind sharp as a blade. Some researchers even suggest Baldwin might have had a different neurological disorder altogether, like Charcot-Marie tooth disease, which causes limb deformities and numbness. If that's true, it means that for centuries, people weren't just calling him Leper King. They were probably misdiagnosing him entirely. Whatever the exact illness, contemporary accounts agree. Baldwin's body weakened, but his mind never faltered. He arranged alliances, planned military campaigns, and even chose his successor, all while his own kingdom and his own body were crumbling around him. He died at just 24, and considering the war, disease, and politics stacked against him, that was nothing short of miraculous. Baldwin wasn't a holy miracle or a cursed zombie king. He was a brilliant, unlucky teenager who ruled a kingdom under siege and did it better than most healthy men twice his age. Now, speaking of medieval surprises, let's step away from Jerusalem and into a quiet European convent where archaeologists were expecting the usual. Bones, rosary beads, maybe a rusty shoe buckle. Instead, they unearthed a jaw-dropping find, the skeleton of a nun, still in her religious habit, with the remains of a newborn baby curled up against her ribcage. It doesn't take a historian to know that's awkward. Naturally, this discovery sparked all kinds of speculation. Was she assaulted? Did she have a secret lover? Was this a forbidden affair with a priest? Cue the medieval soap opera music. Enter ancient DNA testing, the modern-day version of confession, but with fewer candles and more lab coats. The results? The baby was indeed her biological child. So much for the miracle theory. This nun had broken her vow of chastity and left behind undeniable evidence. Childbirth in convents wasn't unheard of, but it was a scandal. Most records of such events were hushed up or destroyed. The fact that she was buried with full religious rites tells us the convent likely forgave her, or simply swept the whole incident under the altar to avoid church interference. We may never know who the father was: a knight, a farmhand, a monk, or someone far worse. But the bones whisper a story of secrecy, tragedy, and perhaps forgiveness. And if that doesn't make you sit up straighter, let's get to a discovery that had conspiracy theorists grinning. A mystery skull with a shape so strange it sent whispers of aliens echoing through the internet. Long, haunting, stretched like something out of a sci-fi movie. This skull turned heads for decades until researchers finally revealed the truth. No, it wasn't an alien. It was the result of cranial deformation, an ancient practice where parents gently bound a baby's head to shape it as it grew. This wasn't done out of malice. It was seen as beautiful, even regal, in many cultures, including some early medieval and nomadic societies. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of braces, Botox, and every beauty filter you've ever used, except permanent. Finally, let's end on a story that feels ripped straight from Arthurian legend. Picture a kid skipping stones on a lake in England when, clunk, the rock hits metal. Not a boot, not a bucket, a full medieval sword. Cue every journalist in the country making Excalibur jokes. Archaeologists later confirmed the sword was real, dating back to somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries. Was it a ritual offering? A desperate knight tossing his blade to avoid capture? Or just an unlucky warrior losing his favorite weapon in a muddy fight? Whatever the case, it's a powerful reminder that medieval history is never fully buried. It's just waiting, sometimes underwater, to be found again. If you've ever had the misfortune of dropping your phone in the toilet, you know how heartbreakingly easy it is to lose something precious to water. Now, picture that same principle, only swap your phone for several tons of stone and add a few thousand years of mystery. Somewhere out in the English countryside, nestled between sleepy sheep pastures and pubs with names like the Drunken Duck, stands a cluster of ancient stones ominously nicknamed the Whispering Knights. They're part of the Rollright Stones complex, a prehistoric stone circle that looks like someone ordered a druid-themed IKEA set and abandoned it halfway through assembly. But don't let the name fool you. These so-called knights aren't remotely knight-shaped. Instead, 5 towering stones lean inward as if mid-conversation, huddling like co-workers gossiping at the medieval office water cooler. For centuries, locals swore that on certain nights, especially under the full moon, you could hear the stones whispering to each other. And of course, if you turned your back on them, well, that's when the spooky part began. Folklore claimed they were cursed knights, turned to stone as punishment for plotting to overthrow a king. Because, of course, in medieval Britain, if you so much as broke curfew, someone declared you a statue by divine justice. The story was wonderfully eerie, until science showed up and ruined the magic like a fairy tale buskill. Geologists rolled in and said, "Actually, these aren't knights at all. In truth, they date all the way back to around 3500 BC, long before swords, chainmail, or quests for the Holy Grail. And they aren't random either. Their alignment suggests they were ritualistic, possibly astronomical, a Stone Age way of tracking the stars. Basically, Neolithic people loved 2 things: big rocks and pointing them dramatically toward the heavens. But what about the whispering? This is where things get genuinely cool. Modern acoustic tests revealed that sound behaves oddly around the stones. Their shape and spacing create natural echo chambers that carry whispers farther than you'd expect. To a pre-science mind, this must have felt like sorcery, curses, or maybe just cosmic gossip about your haircut. Today, the Whispering Knights still tilt toward each other like they're exchanging secrets. And honestly, if you've ever stood next to a tight little group at a party and wondered if they were talking about you, yeah, that's the vibe. Haunted? Probably not. Acoustically suspicious? Absolutely. Speaking of suspicion, in medieval Europe, how your body behaved after death could make or break your reputation. If you rotted like everyone else, fine. But if your corpse stayed unervingly fresh, you had 2 options: sainthood or stake through the chest. If the local priest liked you, congratulations, you might just get your own shrine and stained glass window. If not, you were suddenly the stuff of vampire legends, and someone was hammering oak through your ribcage before you could say, Amen. Take one curious case from a small monastery in Eastern Europe. A nun, quiet, devout, aggressively unremarkable, died in winter and was buried as usual. But months later, when her remains were moved, her body was found completely intact. Cue whispers of miracles, villagers lighting candles, and at least one terrified kitchen boy fainting dramatically. Fast forward a few centuries and enter science, carrying DNA kits and fungal swabs. Researchers discovered that this miracle wasn't divine at all, just microbiology. In cold, dry crypts, bodies can dehydrate quickly, turning into natural mummies. Sometimes the fat even turns into a waxy, soap-like substance, a process called saponification, which sounds magical but is really just chemistry doing its thing. Our nun had been buried in a lime-rich, well-ventilated crypt, basically nature's walk-in freezer. No demons, no angels, just perfect preservation conditions. And the final twist? Analysis of her stomach revealed a diet consisting almost entirely of pickled fish and rye porridge. Hardly the feast of a future saint. Still, her story reminds us how thin the line between miracle and science can be. especially in an age when people were terrified, superstitious, and considered bloodletting a medical innovation. And speaking of fear, let's talk about crime in Victorian London. When most people imagine detectives of that era, they picture a foggy street, a man in a bowler hat, collar turned up, magnifying glass in hand, basically Sherlock Holmes. But reality gave us something far more interesting. Scotland Yard. Founded in 1829 by Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, the Metropolitan Police kept order on London's increasingly crowded streets. But soon, the city's criminals got bolder: jewel thieves, con artists, murderers, crimes too complex for a nightstick and a whistle. So, in 1842, Scotland Yard formed its very first detective branch. Just 8 plainclothes officers who immediately creeped everyone out. Victorians didn't like the idea of men without uniforms sneaking around in pubs, spying on gangs, and disguising themselves to infiltrate criminal circles. Newspapers mocked them as spies, and respectable citizens worried they were half criminal themselves. But when a case truly shocked the public, guess who they called? Scotland Yard's detectives. These men hunted jewel thieves, tracked con men posing as aristocrats, and even unraveled political plots when Europe was simmering with revolution fever. They became the pioneers of professional detective work, blending street smarts, instinct, and the slowly emerging tools of forensic science. By the 1860s, they were turning up in courtrooms with hard evidence instead of gossip, their testimony carrying weight that could make or break a trial. High-profile cases, like the hunt for the infamous garroters, who strangled victims in dark alleys, turned the Yard into a symbol of justice rather than suspicion. And while they started as a distrusted experiment, by the end of the Victorian era, Scotland Yard detectives were the very image of methodical, sharp-eyed investigators, laying the groundwork for the true crime genre as we know it. At the same time, forensic science was having its own revolution. Early in the century, murder investigations were often glorified guesswork. A coroner might glance at a body, ask 2 witnesses what they saw, and call it a day. But gradually, physicians began treating the corpse as a silent witness, a book of clues waiting to be read. This was the birth of forensic autopsies. Doctors started examining stomach contents for poison, measuring bruises to determine timing of injuries, and studying blood patterns to reconstruct the crime scene. Toxicology became a game-changer. Suddenly, arsenic, the so-called inheritance powder, could be detected scientifically. Murderers were no longer just caught by confession or rumor, but by chemistry. The public was fascinated, horrified, and glued to courtrooms as medical experts held up vials and explained chemical reactions. Newspapers covered these moments like theater, turning science into front-page drama. And just like that, dissection, once a grim, whispered business, became one of the most exciting tools of justice. People were beginning to grasp something revolutionary, that crimes once dismissed as unsolvable could now be cracked wide open by evidence that didn't lie, didn't forget, and couldn't be bribed. But, as with most innovations, this new world of scientific crime-solving was not without its critics. Many Victorians still shuddered at the thought of cutting into the dead. Religious and superstitious fears loomed large. Desecrating a body risked disturbing the soul, or so they believed. Others cast a suspicious eye on the doctors themselves. Could a man in a lab coat truly hold more authority than an eyewitness who swore on the Bible? And to be fair, mistakes were made. Some trials descended into chaos as expert witnesses contradicted each other, leaving juries bewildered and skeptics with plenty of fuel. Yet slowly, almost stubbornly, the autopsy found its place. By the second half of the 19th century, it was no longer just a morbid curiosity, it was a cornerstone of justice. The inquest was no longer a small-town ritual where neighbors traded gossip about the dead. It had become a stage where science stood up and spoke louder than rumor, transforming death from a mystery into a source of undeniable evidence. The corpse itself became a witness, offering detectives testimony that was silent, but impossible to ignore. For most of history, however, proving someone's identity in court was a nightmare. Suspects could lie, Witnesses could misremember, and even the new miracle of photography wasn't foolproof. A clever criminal could grow a beard, change his name, and slip into the anonymity of London fog. That all changed in the late 19th century when an idea smaller than a fingertip redefined criminal justice forever: fingerprinting. The notion that every fingerprint is unique wasn't completely new. Ancient civilizations had noticed the strange patterns on fingers, but it was Victorian science that took this observation and turned it into proof. In the 1880s, Sir Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin and a man who loved measuring everything, began to study fingerprints in obsessive detail. He categorized the whorls, loops, and arches that make each fingerprint unique. Galton's work wasn't just academic theory. It laid the foundation for a whole new system of criminal identification. He even calculated the astronomical odds of two people sharing the exact same fingerprint pattern, proving that these ridges on our skin were nature's signature. Then came Sir Edward Henry, the Inspector General of Police in Bengal, who turned Galton's research into something practical. He developed a classification system later known as the Henry system that allowed fingerprints to be filed, compared, and retrieved with astonishing speed. Scotland Yard adopted it, and suddenly, identity wasn't just a matter of memory or luck. It was written permanently in the ridges of your hand. The first true test of this new science came in 1902, right as the Victorian era was drawing to a close. A burglar named Harry Jackson left a single fingerprint on a freshly painted windowsill. When it matched the one on file, he was convicted. No confession, no eyewitness, just cold, hard science. It was a quiet revolution that made front-page news. Victorians were fascinated, and a little terrified. The idea that your very skin could betray you felt almost magical, as though the body itself carried a secret truth that could not be denied. But it also carried a chilling message. No matter how clever you were, there was no hiding from the forensic gaze of modern policing. Before this breakthrough, repeat offenders were caught by little more than luck and memory. A constable might recognize a familiar face, or a victim might try to describe a thief's crooked nose, but these methods were fragile. A change of clothes, a false name, and the criminal vanished. The Victorians, with their obsession for classification, wanted something better. Thus came two powerful innovations: the mugshot and the criminal record. Photography was still a novelty in the mid-19th century, but police forces quickly saw its potential. By the 1860s, mugshots were being taken in police stations across Britain, stark, emotionless portraits, front and side view, designed not to flatter but to capture. For the first time, a criminal's face could be permanently stored, compared, and recognized, no matter how many disguises he tried. Newspapers occasionally reprinted these mugshots, scandalizing respectable Victorians who feared the spread of rogues' galleries. But for detectives, it was an incredible new advantage. A face once forgotten could now be remembered forever. Still, photographs alone weren't enough. Enter Alphonse Bertillon, a French police officer who pioneered the science of anthropometry, the measurement of the human body. Bertillon believed that every person was physically unique. By recording precise measurements, skull size, arm span, ear shape, and combining them with mugshots, police could identify criminals with near-scientific certainty. Scotland Yard quickly adopted this meticulous system. Though eventually replaced by fingerprinting, it was the first true attempt to turn the human body into data, a revolutionary idea. The criminal record became a Victorian obsession, with every alias, crime, and sentence neatly written on index cards. This changed policing from a reactive pursuit into something proactive. Detectives could now trace a suspect's history across years and cities, building entire criminal profiles. It was a cultural turning point. Society began to view crime not as random evil, but as something that could be studied, catalogued, even predicted. But no crime captured Victorian fear quite like poisoning. Unlike a gunshot or stab wound, poison was invisible, silent, and often delivered at the dinner table by someone trusted. Arsenic, nicknamed inheritance powder, was cheap, tasteless, and available in any chemist shop. With life insurance policies and family fortunes at stake, it became the weapon of choice for the cold-blooded. Science had to catch up, and fast. The turning point came in 1836, when chemist James Marsh invented the Marsh test, a reliable way to detect arsenic in the body. For the first time, prosecutors could show juries chemical proof of murder instead of pointing fingers over a suspicious cup of tea. The Marsh test became a courtroom sensation. Juries watched in awe as experts demonstrated how a trace of arsenic could be made visible. Suddenly, the laboratory became a weapon against crime. Soon other chemists developed tests for strychnine, cyanide, and opium derivatives, giving birth to toxicology as a full-fledged science. Defense lawyers, of course, fought back, calling chemists charlatans and accusing their tests of being flawed. And indeed, early toxicology wasn't perfect. Some innocent people were tragically condemned. But public fascination only grew. Newspapers breathlessly reported every chemical test, turning grim murder trials into theater. The impact rippled through everyday life. Chemists began labeling poisons more carefully, and governments tightened regulations. Murderers found it harder to get their hands on deadly substances, though some still tried. And the Victorians, obsessed with the macabre, devoured penny dreadfuls and novels where villains wielded chemistry like black magic. By the twilight of the 19th century, forensic chemistry had become one of Scotland Yard's sharpest weapons. Each test tube, each reaction chipped away at murder's cloak of invisibility. Even the most carefully plotted crime now left behind traces that could not be ignored, proof that science had finally joined the eternal struggle between law and lawlessness. Picture a Victorian murder scene before the era of forensic discipline, chaos everywhere. Crowds poured into narrow alleys, neighbors pawed through belongings out of morbid curiosity, and even the police, well-meaning as they were, often disturbed vital evidence without realizing it. A bloody footprint might be smeared beyond recognition, a weapon picked up and handled by curious hands, and with that, the truth of the crime vanished forever. It was during the 19th century that a profound realization dawned on investigators. The crime scene itself was a witness. Its silence could be deafening, but it held answers if only someone would stop to look and listen. One of the most haunting examples was the case of Jack the Ripper in the late 1880s. Though his identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries, the detectives of Scotland Yard working the foggy, gaslit streets of Whitechapel began to adopt something new method. They cataloged wounds with painstaking detail, sketched crime scenes, compared injuries, and searched for repeating patterns. True, their efforts were hindered by poor lighting, panicked crowds, and the sheer brutality of the crimes. Yet, those murders forced London to understand that crime-solving wasn't just about chasing a suspect down a dark alley. It was about analyzing where and how the crime occurred. The scene itself was telling a story, and for the first time, investigators were learning to read it. Photography soon joined the detectives' arsenal, and it changed everything. By the 1860s, police were photographing not only criminals but crime scenes themselves. These stark images captured every detail: the position of a body, the placement of a weapon, the exact state of a room before a single object was moved. This was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, detectives could revisit a crime scene weeks, months, or even years later. Courts could be shown visual evidence instead of relying on memory or description. Alongside photography came the practice of collecting physical evidence. Stray fibers, strands of hair, scraps of fabric, even dirt and soil samples began to be preserved rather than swept away. Victorian investigators didn't yet have DNA or microscopes capable of modern precision, but they had already embraced a key principle. Every crime leaves a trace. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Crowds still trampled through scenes, reporters got in the way, and sometimes even the police couldn't resist tampering with evidence. But the seed had been planted. Investigators learned to measure, mark, and record before disturbing anything. By the end of the Victorian era, A crime scene had transformed from a chaotic free-for-all into a carefully controlled stage of inquiry. Detectives were no longer just hunters. They were readers, piecing together the silent story written in bloodstains, footprints, and broken furniture. This shift elevated detective work from rumor and guesswork into something approaching a science, and the public loved it. By the mid-Victorian era, the detective was no longer just a plainclothes officer lurking in taverns. He was becoming a cultural icon. Newspapers eagerly reported on the exploits of Scotland Yard's men, sometimes exaggerating their daring for a public hungry for tales of crime and justice. Literature soon seized on this fascination. Charles Dickens, ever captivated by London's underworld, often accompanied Scotland Yard officers on patrol, and his novels were filled with sharp-eyed observers who sniffed out secrets. This primed readers to accept the idea that deduction itself could be an art form. Then came Wilkie Collins, whose 1868 novel The Moonstone introduced Sergeant Cuff, a brilliant, slightly eccentric detective modeled on real-life yard men. Cuff's meticulous attention to detail made him the clear ancestor of the most famous sleuth of all, Sherlock Holmes. When Arthur Conan Doyle introduced Holmes in 1887, he became an instant phenomenon. Half scientist, half magician, Holmes used magnifying glasses, chemical tests, and razor-sharp logic to solve crimes. A perfect reflection of the genuine advances in Victorian policing. He was also everything readers dreamed a detective could be: cool under pressure, contemptuous of fools, always several steps ahead. Scotland Yard admired Holmes but also resented him. The public began assuming fictional detectives were cleverer than the real ones, and the Yard was forced to live up to that ideal. Yet Holmes forever cemented the detective as a heroic figure, a knight of intellect battling the forces of chaos. This cultural obsession had real-world consequences. Criminals became characters in an ongoing drama. Their crimes transformed into puzzles for brilliant minds to solve. Penny dreadfuls and serialized magazines turned real investigations into cliffhangers, blurring the line between entertainment and justice. Detectives, both real and fictional, became symbols of hope, proof that order could triumph over even the most horrific crimes. But there was unease too. Detectives spied, infiltrated gangs, used disguises, and kept relentless watch. To some Victorians, they seemed too close to the criminals they hunted, a necessary evil that both reassured and unnerved the public. And yet, this paradox only deepened their mystique. By century's end, the detective was not just a job but a myth, representing the Victorian dream that intellect, observation, and reason could pierce even the darkest mysteries. As the century turned, Victorians took this faith in science a step further, into the eerie territory of criminal profiling. Could science not just catch a criminal but predict one? This idea was both fascinating and terrifying. In an age haunted by poverty, rising crime, and the specter of Jack the Ripper, the notion that a person's face or skull could reveal their criminality became wildly popular. Phrenology and physiognomy, now considered pseudosciences, claimed the bumps on your head or the set of your jaw revealed your true character. Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso argued that criminals were atavistic throwbacks, evolutionary throwbacks with primitive features like sloping foreheads or asymmetrical faces. His theories spread across Europe and Britain, debated in courtrooms, universities, and police circles. At Scotland Yard, detectives were quietly urged to look beyond what a suspect had done and consider who he was. The Ripper murders encouraged even more speculation. Surely such savagery could only be committed by someone insane, foreign, or monstrous. Doctors produced the first psychological sketches, describing the killer as solitary, resentful, and sexually deviant. Of course, these early profiles reflected just as many Victorian prejudices as genuine insight. Immigrants, the poor, and the mentally ill were often painted as natural criminals, a convenient justification for tighter social control. Yet, amidst the pseudoscience, there were real steps forward. Detectives began to recognize patterns. Repeat offenders often struck in familiar places, under familiar conditions. Criminal psychology, however primitive, pushed investigations toward understanding motive as well as method. By the close of the Victorian era, profiling had become a controversial but enduring tool, a strange mixture of prejudice and progress that laid the groundwork for modern criminal psychology. And so, as the 20th century dawned, policing had been utterly transformed. The century that began with constables carrying rattles and chasing suspects by instinct ended with detectives wielding fingerprints, photography, toxicology, and an emerging body of forensic science. Justice was no longer about luck or coerced confession. It was about evidence, procedure, and method. Scotland Yard stood proudly at the center of this revolution. Its detectives, once viewed as suspicious spies, had become global symbols of professionalism. Police forces from Paris to New York borrowed their methods. Even in cases where the villain escaped, like Jack the Ripper, the public recognized that detectives were applying reason, not superstition. And perhaps the greatest legacy of all was cultural. The Victorians left us the enduring myth of the detective as a hero of intellect and rationality, a symbol of hope that mystery can always be conquered by observation and logic. Sherlock Holmes may have been fictional, but he embodied a very real truth, that science and reason had forever changed the game of crime-solving. That deep Victorian faith in logic and progress spilled beyond science journals and into the cobblestone streets of real policing. It fed the belief that reason, not chaos, would be the final judge, that order could always triumph over disorder. Yet the legacy of this movement was not entirely without shadows. The early science of criminology and profiling, though groundbreaking, often reflected the prejudices of its time. It sometimes labeled the poor, immigrants, or those suffering from mental illness as born criminals, justifying new forms of surveillance and control. The Victorians had an almost obsessive urge to catalog and classify. That impulse could be brilliant, giving us fingerprints, photography, and crime scene preservation, but it could also blur the line between protecting society and intruding upon it. Still, even with its moral flaws, this period laid an indispensable foundation for everything that followed. Modern criminal investigations, DNA testing, forensic psychology, even digital crime solving, all owe a debt to those early Victorian experiments. They were the first generation to truly imagine a justice system ruled by evidence rather than superstition. Their successes, and just as importantly, their mistakes, built a blueprint for the forensics we take for granted today. The century that began with lanternlit patrols ended with laboratories, fingerprint cards, and detectives who were both feared and admired. Symbols of a new world where the voice of evidence would one day speak louder than rumor. And just as the Victorians were reshaping the science of justice, a very different brotherhood in medieval Europe was reshaping the meaning of faith and duty. For a young man aspiring to join the Knights Templar, the journey did not begin with swordplay or gallant banners fluttering on the wind. It began with silence and shadow. The initiation was held in the stillness of a chapel, often at night, when flickering candles threw long, dancing shadows across ancient stone walls. The air was heavy with incense, as if to remind the candidate that he was about to cross a threshold, leaving behind the world of ordinary men to enter a life bound by mystery, obedience, and eternal vigilance. Secrecy was everything. Before a single vow was spoken, the initiate was led away from his companions, questioned privately by senior knights, and warned that what he was about to promise would bind him until death. There could be no retreat. Witnesses were strictly limited, and no outsider was ever allowed to watch. This veil of secrecy gave the ritual an almost theatrical intensity, and it is precisely this secrecy that fueled centuries of speculation and legend. When the questioning was done, the candidate was brought before the assembled brothers, kneeling on the cold stones before the altar. The Grand Master or presiding officer would ask a series of piercing questions. Was the man free of debt? Was he bound by fealty to another lord or bishop? Did he truly understand that he was pledging his life to poverty, chastity, and obedience? These were no mere formalities. They were safeguards, ensuring that the man they accepted would not bring divided loyalties into the order. If his answers satisfied the assembly, he was asked again, even at this late hour, whether he wished to proceed. Tradition held that a candidate was given multiple opportunities to withdraw, so that no man could ever say he had been tricked or pressured. But if he stood firm, the atmosphere grew heavy with purpose. The chapel fell silent. The brothers bowed their heads. The initiate prepared to cross the final threshold, to shed his old identity and be reborn as a soldier of Christ. At this point, the ceremony moved from words to transformation. The man would be stripped of his worldly clothes, a symbolic death of his former self, and then clothed in the white mantle of the Templars. The mantle itself carried enormous meaning. White for purity of soul and body, a constant reminder that the knight had sworn chastity and must remain unsullied by earthly temptations. In times of war, this mantle would bear a blood-red cross, not just decoration, but a pledge that its wearer was prepared to die for Christ and the defense of the Holy Land. He might be handed a belt and a sword, though both were considered the property of the order rather than the man. The sword, ritually blessed, symbolized both the protection of the innocent and the punishment of evil, but never for personal vengeance or glory. This weapon was consecrated, meant to serve only God's cause. Some accounts even describe the initiate lying prostrate before the altar, his body stretched out in surrender, as prayers were chanted over him. Others speak of him kissing the ground or the cross, physical acts of humility, reminders that he was nothing without divine mercy. These moments stripped him of pride and anchored him in obedience. When the white mantle finally rested on his shoulders, he was no longer simply a man, but a Miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. The mantle was both privilege and burden, a sign that he now belonged not to himself, not to any earthly lord, but to the mysterious and powerful order of the temple. And then came the most secretive part of all, the whispered prayers. Unlike the loud, public chants of a cathedral mass, these words were spoken softly, passed from elder to novice like keys to a hidden kingdom. The chapel, already dim, seemed to grow darker as the knights intoned their secret formulas. For the initiate, this was a moment of awe and of unease. The prayers were rooted in Christian liturgy, invoking Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, but their rhythm was unique to the Templars, their meaning guarded. Outsiders, denied entry to these rites, grew suspicious. Rumors spread, some claiming the knights denied Christ, others that they spat upon the cross or worshipped strange idols. While historians today agree that such accusations were likely fabrications, often invented by enemies of the order, the secrecy of these ceremonies made them irresistible to gossip. And thus, the Templars became more than just a military order. They became a mystery, a brotherhood forever shrouded in both admiration and fear. During those hushed, candlelit devotions, the young initiate was not merely reciting words. He was being reshaped. Every vow was framed as a divine echo of Christ's own path. Poverty was presented not as loss but as liberation, the way of the Savior who had no place to lay his head and relied entirely on heaven's provision. Chastity was praised as angelic, a choice that freed the knight's heart and mind so that no earthly distraction could weaken his sword arm. And above all, obedience was exalted as the highest form of strength, compared to Christ's own surrender in Gethsemane. In that chapel, the initiate was urged to see himself not as a man of ambition or pride, but as a vessel through which God's will could flow. The brothers surrounding him deepened the gravity of the moment. Their silence between prayers, the faint rustle of their mantles, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off steel and stone. It was an atmosphere both intimate and overwhelming, a reminder that he was no longer a lone man but part of a spiritual phalanx, a brotherhood that would pray together, fight together, and, if destiny demanded, die together. To outsiders, these whispered prayers became evidence of dangerous secrets. To those within, they were sacred glue, a cement that fused every knight's soul to the order and to the great mystery of its mission. The ritual prayers stitched the vows into the very fabric of the initiate's being. They marked what could only be described as the spiritual birth of a Templar. But words alone were never enough for this order. To prove that a man truly understood obedience, he would often face trials, tests that were small in act but great in meaning. These trials were not designed to humiliate, but to engrave one truth into the knight's soul, that obedience must be instant, unquestioning, and complete, whether in the silence of a chapel or in the chaos of battle. Accounts of these trials differ, and centuries of rumor have only blurred the picture further. Some sources describe an initiate being ordered to kneel for long periods, to remain silent while others mocked him, or to endure symbolic gestures of humility. These acts were not cruelty, but tools meant to crush pride, strip away ego, and forge a man who would never hesitate when commanded. If he could not obey in these small tests, how could he be trusted to hold the line on the battlefield, where hesitation could cost lives? Other trials were more severe. At the final moment, the candidate might be given one last chance to walk away. Reminded of the endless battles ahead, the life stripped of wealth, the likelihood of hardship, and the very real possibility of dying far from home. The order valued a few unshakable men over a host of half-committed brothers. Later enemies of the Templars would twist these secret trials into accusations of blasphemy, claiming that initiates were forced to spit on the cross or deny Christ. Historians today recognize these stories as propaganda, part of the smear campaign that destroyed the order. But their very existence shows how mysterious and intimidating the Templar rituals appeared to the outside world. What is clear is that the trials forged not just a warrior, but a servant. They stripped away fear and hesitation and remade the initiate into a man who belonged entirely to the order, his brothers, and to God's cause. When the tests were endured, the new knight was embraced, literally, by the brotherhood, folded into the company of men who had already paid the price of commitment. From that moment forward, his life was no longer his own. Every order from his superiors, whether it meant defending a pilgrim on a lonely road, riding headlong into battle, or enduring torture in captivity, was to be followed without question. In the Templar view, obedience was not weakness, but the ultimate strength, the power that allowed hundreds of men to move as one body, wielding God's will like a blade. And then, after the silence of prayer and the severity of trial, came a surprising shift in mood. The ritual closed not in solemn dread, but in fellowship. To seal the new knight's entry, the brothers shared a ritual meal, a feast not of indulgence but of unity. The Templars followed a strict monastic diet, and the table they sat at was deliberately plain. No silver cups, no rich ornaments, no personal luxuries. The order ate from shared bowls, a deliberate sign that all possessions were held in common. The food was simple, coarse bread, beans, vegetables, perhaps watered wine. Meat was rare, permitted only on certain days. And yet, for the new knight, this meal carried a significance far beyond the food. He was sitting shoulder to shoulder with men who had fought at Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre. He was no longer a guest or a petitioner. He was one of them. Even here, discipline ruled. Silence was kept. Scripture was read aloud during the meal. No one was allowed to glance covetously at another man's portion. Eating was a sacred act, reminding each knight that even the smallest routine was to be done in the presence of God. But there was joy here, too. After all the questioning, the trials, the warnings of hardship, the feast was the moment of welcome, the point at which the outsider became a brother. The simple act of breaking bread was a ritual of trust, a sign that among these men, the knight was at peace. Of all the vows spoken that night, one carried a special and terrible weight: the oath of secrecy. Poverty and chastity set him apart from the world. Obedience bound him to his brothers. But secrecy protected the order itself. Without it, the Templars could not function, could not maintain their unity, and could not survive in a hostile world. The initiate was warned in the starkest terms. Nothing he had seen or heard that night could ever be spoken beyond the order's walls. To break this oath was to betray not just his brothers, but God himself. Some accounts say the vow was sealed with physical gestures, a hand on the Gospels, a knee bent before the altar, the touch of sacred relics. The penalty for betrayal was not always described in detail, but the implication was clear. Excommunication, disgrace, even eternal damnation awaited the traitor. The Templars understood that secrecy was a shield, one that guarded their wealth, their strategies, their very survival. Ironically, it was this same secrecy that fed suspicion among their enemies. Because no outsider ever saw the rituals, rumors flourished. Whispers of idol worship, heresy, and unspeakable rites. These tales would one day be turned into weapons that brought the order crashing down. But to the initiate in that moment, secrecy was not sinister but sacred. It marked him as a guardian of mysteries, trusted with knowledge too powerful to be cast before the world. With this final vow, he crossed a last invisible threshold. He now held truths he could never share, not to king, not to pope, not even under threat of death. This vow was an invisible armor, as binding as any chainmail, ensuring that the Templars would remain disciplined, hidden, and formidable. And then, at last, the initiation turned toward blessing. The chapel that had been filled with whispers now swelled with prayer. The presiding master laid his hands upon the new knight's head, invoking God's protection and strength. Psalms were sung, chants rose like a tide, echoing against the stone vaults. The man who had entered the chapel as a candidate now stood as a soldier of Christ, consecrated, bound, and ready to fight, to serve, and, if need be, to die. Poverty, the first vow, was never described as mere deprivation, but as liberation. By casting aside earthly wealth, the knight was said to gain a treasure that could never rust, never be stolen, and never fade. Chastity was painted as a gift of heavenly purity, raising him above the temptations of the world so that his heart and mind might stay fixed on God alone. And then came obedience, the most difficult vow of all, presented as nothing less than the very road Christ himself had walked, submitting even unto death on the cross. By embracing these disciplines, the Templar was promised the highest of rewards, salvation, the martyr's crown, and eternal fellowship with the saints. At this moment, the tone of the ceremony often shifted. The language grew martial. The initiate was told that he now wore the armor of faith and carried the sword of the Spirit. His life no longer belonged to him. It had become a campaign, a holy mission under the direct command of the heavenly King. And should he one day fall in battle defending the Holy Land, his death would not be a tragedy but a triumph, counted as a martyr's victory in heaven. These promises made the dangers of the battlefield not merely bearable, but sacred. The blessing of the ceremony ended with a final charge: to live uprightly, to defend the weak, and to keep the honor of the temple stainless. When the master spoke these words, the gathered knights responded with prayers of welcome, their voices rising like a solemn chorus that sealed the new brother to a destiny far greater than his own. From this moment onward, his life would no longer be shaped by accident or chance, but by divine purpose, sanctified by ritual and by promise. With vows spoken, the mantle laid across his shoulders, and blessings invoked, the final act of initiation was more than words. It was human connection. The embrace of fraternity transformed the initiate from an outsider into one of the temple's own. The senior knight, often the master himself, would step forward and greet the novice with the kiss of peace, a gesture rooted in both monastic tradition and the liturgy of the wider church. It was offered on the cheek or shoulder, a symbol of equality, of reconciliation, of welcome. Then one by one, every knight in the chapel followed suit, offering the same embrace. For the new member, this was perhaps the most powerful moment of all. No longer was he a stranger kneeling in the shadows. He was now a brother, sharing the same destiny as every man present. The rite closed with words of brotherhood. The initiate was reminded that the temple was a family stronger than blood. Men who prayed together, fought together, and would, if God willed it, die together. From this day forward, he would eat at their table, ride under their banner, and share not just their battles but their hardships, their losses, and their victories. Yes, the order demanded much: poverty, chastity, obedience, secrecy. But it offered something just as great in return: the unbreakable fellowship of men who had sworn their lives to one another and to God. After the embrace, the new knight was led to his place among the brothers, as if he had been there all along. His name was recorded in the rolls of the house, a written mark that his life had been woven into the very history of the temple. He was now part of something vast, an international brotherhood stretching from commanderies in France to castles in the Holy Land. That moment carried weight far beyond the ceremony. To betray the order would now mean betraying not just vows and symbols, but the living faces of the men who had welcomed him as kin. To fight bravely was to honor them. To falter was to let them down. Thus ended the initiation. What had begun in secrecy and testing concluded in fellowship and unity. The knight rose from the chapel floor no longer merely a man, but a Templar, clothed in vows, strengthened by blessings, and embraced by a brotherhood that promised both earthly purpose and eternal reward. When the Knights Templar first emerged in the early 12th century, their mission seemed simple: protect pilgrims traveling the long and perilous roads to Jerusalem. Yet it quickly became clear that swords alone were not enough. Roads could be patrolled, yes, but safe havens were needed: fortresses, refuges, outposts of security. And so began one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. The warrior monks became architects of power, building some of the most formidable castles ever seen. Unlike the castles of kings or barons, Templar fortresses were not monuments to a dynasty or family name. They were communal strongholds, consecrated to Christ and dedicated to a collective mission: to defend Christendom and to provide shelter for travelers in a hostile land. These castles were both military and spiritual statements, stone sermons rising from the earth. Each was placed with strategic precision, anchoring trade routes, guarding vital passes, or dominating coastal harbors. Many stood on the very frontiers of the Crusader states, where the clash between Christian and Muslim forces was constant and merciless. Even in Europe, their fortresses served as treasure houses, training grounds, and administrative centers, nodes in a network that stretched from Portugal to the Levant. Wherever a Templar castle appeared, it announced stability and power, a fortress of faith in a world torn by war. Architecturally, they combined brute strength with subtle design. Their walls were massive, their towers angled to deflect siege engines, their gates cleverly arranged to funnel attackers into killing grounds. Yet inside, there were chapels where knights knelt in prayer before riding out to battle. This contrast was intentional: bastions of war housing sanctuaries of devotion, reminding all who entered that these were not mere soldiers' barracks but holy garrisons. Every fortress, from the deserts of Syria to the green hills of Portugal, embodied the Templar paradox. Monk and warrior, sword and psalter, wall and altar. To pilgrims, these strongholds were beacons of safety. To their enemies, they were daunting obstacles, a fusion of military ingenuity and spiritual defiance. The cross carved into the stone was as intimidating as the swords of the knights inside. If there was one fortress that embodied the Templar vision of faith and fortitude, it was Croix de Chevaliers. Rising like a stone crown above the Syrian plains, Croix was more than a fortress. It was a proclamation that the Crusaders had come to stay. Its silhouette, visible for miles, was both a promise and a warning. Though originally built by local lords, Croix was entrusted in 1142 to the Templars' brother order, the Knights Hospitaller, and became the gold standard of Crusader military architecture. Its double concentric walls, deep moats hewn from living rock, and arrow-flanked towers made it nearly impregnable. Within, vast storerooms allowed it to endure sieges for years, and at its heart stood a chapel, plain, austere, lit only by candles, reminding the knights that their battles were fought under heaven's gaze. For Muslim chroniclers, Croix was a nightmare, Saladin himself failed to take it, and only through cunning, a forged letter tricking the defenders into believing they were ordered to surrender, did Sultan Baybars finally capture it in 1271. Even today, Croix de Chevaliers stands as one of the greatest feats of medieval engineering, a living testament to the merging of stone, strategy, and faith. Its walls tell a story not just of war, but of an ideal that faith could quite literally be defended with prayer and steel. And while the Holy Land claimed the Order's greatest glory, their castles in Portugal tell another chapter, one equally vital to history. On the far western edge of Europe, the Templars became crucial allies to Portuguese kings during the long Reconquista. Lands and privileges were granted in return for military aid, and the knights responded by building fortresses that helped anchor the Christian frontier. Among these, none is more iconic than the Castle of Tomar, a masterpiece of Templar design and a cornerstone of Portuguese identity, a story we'll explore in the next chapter. Perched on a commanding hill above the Nabeiro River, Tomar was founded in 1160 by the formidable Grand Master Gualdem Pius. What began as a strategic stronghold soon became far more than a mere castle. It rose to become the beating heart of the Templar presence in Portugal and eventually one of the most influential commanderies in all of Europe. Its iconic round church, inspired by Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre itself, symbolized a direct spiritual thread between this remote Iberian outpost and the sacred soil of the Crusades. But Tomar was only the crown jewel in a much wider Templar network. Across the rugged heartlands of central Portugal, the Order built a chain of fortresses like stepping stones of conquest. Almoral stood defiantly on a rocky island in the Tagus River, its walls mirrored in the water below. Monsanto seemed to grow out of the granite cliffs themselves, while Pombal watched over the vital crossroads that controlled the flow of armies and goods. These fortresses were not passive defenses, they were proclamations of power carved in stone. Each castle secured newly won territory, sheltered Christian settlers, and served as a launch point for fresh campaigns pushing ever southward. Piece by piece, wall by wall, the frontier advanced, reshaping the map of Portugal. The architecture of these castles blended local Iberian traditions with innovations brought home from the Holy Land. Massive curtain walls and arrow-slit towers echoed the Crusader fortresses of Syria, while their placement on cliffs, ridges, and river bends made use of Portugal's dramatic landscape. Within these walls were cloisters, chapels, and refectories, a constant reminder that these were not the castles of feudal lords but the homes of warrior monks, men who lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. When the Templar Order was eventually dissolved, Portugal did not allow its holdings to simply vanish into history. Instead, they were handed to a new institution, the Order of Christ, which carried forward the Templar spirit. Under its banner, Portuguese navigators would set sail into the Atlantic, exploring the coasts of Africa and beyond, turning Tomar into both a spiritual center and a logistical hub for voyages that would transform the known world. Thus, the castles of Portugal were far more than medieval relics. They were foundations, both literal and symbolic, upon which a kingdom and an empire were built. Across the Channel, the story of the Templars took a slightly different shape. In England, their mission was less about defending shifting frontiers and more about consolidating wealth, training recruits, and keeping the river of resources flowing toward the Holy Land. Yet their architecture still bore the unmistakable Templar stamp, stark, disciplined, and spiritually charged. The most famous of these English holdings was the Temple in London, established in the mid-12th century. Though not a fortress in the traditional sense, it was a secure enclave in the very heart of the city. Its round church, modeled after the Holy Sepulchre, remains one of the finest surviving examples of Templar design in the West. Within its walls, knights drilled, prayed, and managed the financial empire that funded crusades abroad. The temple became a medieval banking powerhouse, where kings deposited treasure and pilgrims secured safe conduct for their perilous journeys eastward. Outside London, the Templars developed a network of rural commanderies. In Lincolnshire, they fortified Willowton and Temple Brewer, serving as both recruitment centers and administrative hubs. Templehurst in Yorkshire and Rothley in Leicestershire performed similar functions, smaller than the great bastions of the East but essential to the Templar machine. Each site combined barns, chapels, and barracks, its simplicity reflecting the monastic discipline of the order. These sites carried deep symbolic weight. Their round churches evoked Jerusalem's most sacred shrine, making worshippers feel as though they were stepping into a fragment of the holy city itself. Though their walls were plain, their geometry spoke volumes about eternity, unity, and divine order. If England kept the Templars financially strong, France was their very birthplace. Here, in the early 12th century, the order first took shape, and here many of its most important commanderies rose. French Templar sites often blended the functions of monastery, manor house, and fortress. They were centers of recruitment and administration, but they still bore the stern military character of an order sworn to fight and pray. The commandery of La Couvertoirade in southern France became a fortified village where knights and common folk lived side by side, protected by formidable walls, towers, and a single mighty gate. Inside, chapels and refectories reminded the brothers of their vows, while the high battlements protected both the knights and the peasants who supplied them. Central France hosted key training grounds like Arville and Pains. These were not sprawling castles but efficient compounds. Chapel, dormitories, storerooms, and defensive walls, built to form the perfect crucible for shaping recruits into disciplined warrior monks. Every stone, every arch was a reminder of their purpose. No luxury, no distraction, only prayer, preparation, and readiness for war. Financially, French commanderies were powerhouses. They stored donations, managed estates, and protected the riches that would later be used to equip armies in the East. Their walls were not built to resist sieges by kings, but to deter robbers and ambitious barons. And it was in France that the order met its grim fate. In 1307, King Philip IV turned on the Templars, arresting them en masse. Commanderies that had once symbolized unshakable faith and power became prisons. Many were confiscated, their wealth absorbed by the crown. Yet the ruins still whisper of a time when the Templar network stretched across Europe, a web of farms, chapels, and fortresses all serving a mission greater than any single kingdom. In Spain, the Templars were drawn into the titanic struggle of the Reconquista, one of the longest conflicts in medieval history. Here, the frontier between Christian and Muslim lands was in constant motion, and castles were not mere status symbols but lifelines. Spanish kings welcomed the Templars, granting them vast lands in exchange for military muscle. One of their greatest achievements was the fortress of Ponferrada in Leon. Once a Roman garrison, the Templars rebuilt it into a formidable citadel guarding the pilgrim road to Santiago de Compostela. For travelers, its gates meant safety. For enemies, they meant a wall of stone standing in their way. Farther east, the castle of Monzon became one of the most important Templar bastions. Rising from its rocky perch, it not only defended the plains below but became a place of royal education. The young King James I of Aragon was raised here under Templar protection, proof that the order was as much a political force as a military one. Monzon's massive walls, rectangular towers, and stark interiors embodied the disciplined spirit of the order, every chapel and hall reminding its inhabitants of their holy mission. Through stone and steel, prayer and blood, the Templars carved their legacy across Europe. Their castles were not just military strongholds. They were symbols of faith, discipline, and ambition, paving the way for both the defense of Christendom and the future age of discovery. On Spain's rugged coasts and fertile river valleys, the Templars built fortresses that seemed to rise straight from myth. Take Peníscola, for instance. Its massive walls climb out of a rocky promontory, surrounded on three sides by the Mediterranean's glittering waters. From afar, it appears more like a stone ship anchored forever in the sea. Then there is Miravet, perched high above the Ebro River. Its layered walls and Romanesque chapel dominate the valley below, a symbol of faith and defiance carved into the skyline. Each stronghold was uniquely shaped to its surroundings, yet each carried the same unshakable message. The Templars were the immovable guardians of Christendom. These Spanish castles tell us everything about the Order's dual purpose in Iberia. They were not just warriors shielding pilgrims and patrolling borders. They were pioneers of conquest, securing new territory for Christian settlers, brick by brick, hilltop by hilltop. When the Order was finally dissolved in the early 14th century, these fortresses did not fall silent. Many passed into the hands of rival orders like Calatrava or Montesa, ensuring their walls continued to echo with the clash of arms throughout the Reconquista. Even today, their ruins cling to Spain's hills and coastlines, a stern reminder that the cross and sword were once etched not only into the chronicles of history, but into the very stones of the land. But Spain was just one theater in a far larger story. Beyond the colossal walls of Croix de Chevaliers, the Templars maintained a web of fortresses across the Holy Land, forming an iron chain of Christian power. These castles were more than military outposts. They were a declaration to friend and foe alike that the Templars were no mere visitors. They were here to stay. One of their most strategic holdings was Safed, rebuilt in the mid-13th century high above Galilee. From its dizzying heights, the Templars could watch the valleys and trade routes for miles around. Safed was a complete world unto itself. Living quarters, storerooms, chapels. A fortress in the clouds that made a statement to both ally and enemy. We are watching, we are unshakable. Farther south, in the harsh deserts of Jordan, stood the fearsome castle of Carrick. Though often held by other Crusader lords, the Templars frequently joined in its defense. Its massive walls, dungeons, and deep cisterns were grim monuments to the brutal reality of frontier warfare. Further north, Bagras and Tortosa guarded crucial mountain passes and the vulnerable coastlines, forming a chain of strong points that kept the Christian presence alive in a hostile world. None of these castles stood alone. They were pieces of a network designed for rapid response. A signal fire lit at one fortress could have relief on the way from another within hours. And inside these grim bastions, daily life was as monastic as it was military. Chapels stood at the heart of each fortress, and the rhythm of prayer structured the garrison's days. Every arrow slit and tower was balanced by an altar, reminding the brothers that their fight was as much spiritual as it was physical. Even Muslim chroniclers, who despised the Crusaders, grudgingly admired the engineering of these fortresses. Siege after siege battered their walls, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, and even in defeat, they became legends. Places where a handful of knights held off entire armies. But nothing lasts forever. The final fall of the Holy Land in the late 13th century marked the beginning of the end. Many fortresses were dismantled or absorbed into Muslim defenses. Today, their ruins still cling to the hillsides, overlooking the same valleys they once ruled, silent witnesses to an age when warrior monks carved out bastions of faith at the very heart of the Crusades. And yet, these were never just castles. They were sermons in stone. Every wall, every arch, every chapel embodied the Templars' mission, a fusion of monk and knight, sword and cross. Their architecture was not only designed to resist siege engines, but to preach a message of discipline, obedience, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. The round churches found within their castles were especially powerful symbols. Modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, they allowed a knight standing in distant England or France to feel spiritually connected to Christ's tomb itself. The circle carried its own deep meaning: unity, eternity, and divine order. Crosses carved or painted on walls and gates announced that these places belonged to no king, no baron, but to Christ himself. Even the layout of their castles held spiritual significance. Perched high on hilltops, they seemed like earthly reflections of a heavenly citadel, ever watchful. Fortresses guarding pilgrim routes doubled as metaphors for spiritual protection, defending souls as much as they defended lives. Inside, the austerity was striking. Plain chapels, bare dormitories, long communal refectories where every brother ate as an equal before God. This powerful combination of martial might and sacred symbolism inspired awe and fear. Outsiders whispered that the Templars harbored secret rites, hidden knowledge, perhaps even forbidden power. But to the knights themselves, the meaning was crystal clear. Every fortress was a proclamation of their mission, a reminder that their order was an earthly extension of divine will. When the Templar order was crushed in the early 14th century, their castles did not disappear with them. Stone is stubborn. Some fortresses were seized by greedy kings, others handed over to rival orders, and a few slowly surrendered to time, crumbling into romantic ruins. Yet the Templar legacy endured. In Portugal, their castles were taken over by the Order of Christ, which would go on to sponsor the Great Age of Discovery, turning Tomar into the launchpad for voyages that opened the world. In Spain, Monzon, Miravet, and Peníscola continued to stand as frontiers of war until the Reconquista was complete. France took a darker path. Many Templar commanderies were confiscated, their treasuries looted, their halls turned into prisons or secular estates. But their aura of secrecy only grew, spawning legends of hidden treasure and curses that still fascinate us today. England's Templar round churches fared far better than most. The Temple Church in London still stands today, a rare survivor of centuries of turmoil. After the fall of the Templars, it passed into the hands of the legal societies, the Inns of Court, who still care for it to this very day. In this way, the Templar legacy wasn't erased but quietly stitched into the cultural and institutional fabric of the nation itself. And that's the power of these places. These castles, chapels, and ruins are not just crumbling relics. They are storytellers. Their very stones whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that the Templar story was never just about dramatic trials or tragic executions. It was about endurance, about discipline, sacrifice, and ambition so great that even destruction could not silence it. Through their architecture, the Templars achieved something they never could secure in life: permanence. Their vision lives on, carved into stone, waiting for us to notice. So what do you think? When you walk through one of these Templar sites, do you feel like you're stepping back into their world? Or do you think their story has been too romanticized over the centuries? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love seeing how you interpret these echoes of the past. If you enjoyed this journey into the Templar legacy, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. It helps grow our historical community here at Vassal Truths, where we uncover the hidden corners of history and give the past a voice. Stay curious, because history still has so many secrets left to tell.